Bojo Ni Khan, Bobby Trey Trousdale, Nadeshnikovs, Tecumseh, Oklahoma, and Adochbia. Hello, friends. My name is Bobby Trey Trousdale, and I am from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. I'm a citizen of Citizen Potawatomi Nation and have recently joined Native Americans in Philanthropy to serve as their education resource facilitator. Wherever you are joining our conversation from today, it is my honor to welcome you back to Native Americans in Philanthropy member education sessions. Today's conversations will be centering ourselves in and exploring Indigenous food sovereignty as a topic. I cannot wait for you to meet our speakers in just a few moments. If this is your first time joining us, welcome in. The goal of these sessions is to share topics and issues that affect our communities from the perspectives of those specializing in these areas and provide an opportunity for the philanthropic sector to learn as well as to take action. The group convening today should be doing just that as we delve deeper into food security. Indigenous people have a rich history of sustainable food production, hunting, and gathering practices. However, these practices have been interrupted by colonization, land disposition, and climate change. Loss of traditional foodways and lack of access to healthy foods have also led to food insecurity in many tribal communities. Our communities are resilient, though. The Indigenous food sovereignty movement has gained momentum throughout Indian country to regain access to and control of traditional foodways. In each of their own ways, our speakers are on the front lines of this reemergence. We look forward to their stories and hope you enjoyed today's topic as we learn more about the issues, concerns, and strategies impacting food security and the preservation of traditional systems in Indigenous communities. We invite you to partake in this digital community via live chat and to submit questions for our speakers that may be addressed near the end of our time together. Without further delay, I'd like to welcome back today's moderator and a dear friend to us here at Native Americans in Philanthropy, Steph Poston. Steph serves as president and CEO of Poston and Associates, and we're glad she's able to continue on in this journey of member education alongside us throughout the series. Steph, welcome back.
Hi, Trey. Welcome to Native Americans in Philanthropy. We're super excited to have you and to all the gifts, experience, insight that you're going to bring. So excited to work alongside you as we take this journey together to help and educate and do incredible outreach. But today we start the day. I'm coming to you live from Albuquerque, New Mexico, or my tribe, which is immediately north of Albuquerque, New Mexico, the Pueblo of Sandia. And what a timely, it's timely for this conversation, right? We're enjoying our harvest here. There's a lot going on. It's beautiful fall air right here in New Mexico, the land of enchantment, beautiful home to many tribes. Super excited about the panel today. They have a lot of expertise, a lot of insight, and just have a passion in the area of food sovereignty. So without further ado, I will ask our first panelist, Whitney Sawney, if she can come up and introduce herself.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Whitney Sawney. I am a citizen of Cherokee Nation. I am the Director of Communications and Policy for the Native American Agriculture Fund. I'm calling in today from Fayetteville, Arkansas. We're a little bit rainy weather here today, but it's still enjoyable. Originally, the traditional homelands of the Osage, Caddo, and Ogapa people, so I want to acknowledge that today and where I'm calling in from. But also, I just want to thank you for your time in being present with us here today as we're talking about investing in Indigenous food sovereignty and what that looks like from an Indigenous lens. So thank you, and I'm glad to be on the panel.
Thanks, Whitney. The other panelist today is Natalie Benally, which actually is coming from my state as well. So welcome, Natalie.
Hello, yat bene everyone. She Natalie Benally and Shia. Nahabani and Shlint Kachini Bashishin and his Ejitishato Twabai Edashinella, Egata Edina Essentially. So hello, my name is Natalie Benally. I am born into the Grace Creek Inspeople clan, born for the Red Running Into Water clan. My maternal grandparents' clan is the Zuni Pueblo people clan, and my paternal grandparents' clan is the Water Ed people clan, and that's how I identify as a Diné woman. I am originally from the Navajo Nation, which is the Four Corners area, but I'm coming to you live from Ogapoge, also known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm a filmmaker and the co-founder of Sonato, which is a mixed media storytelling company which aims to tell stories in which medium fits them best. And one of those stories is the documentary that I executive produced called Indigenize the Plate, which focuses on food sustainability and how that relates to cultural sustainability, and what are ways and solutions we can go about trying to not just revitalize, but continue on traditions, whether that's agricultural or storytelling. So there you go. There's the gist of what it is that I do. So
Yeah, I love the title, Indigenize the Plate, and I think we're going to hear more about that a little bit later. So thank you both for joining us and taking the time for this important topic and timely topic, as I mentioned. So let me get into it with the first question, and I'll start and direct that over to Natalie. How would you characterize or describe the important work that you and your respective organizations are doing in and around Indigenous food sovereignty?
Awesome. Well, one of those examples, obviously, is the full-length documentary that is currently airing nationally. So if you go to www.pbs.org, you can see when it's airing in your area. But Indigenize the Plate is an example of what it is that my storytelling company aims to do, because we all understand and have seen the power of sharing stories in multiple capacities from multiple perspectives. And so one of the big goals of this project and all the projects that we do with Sonato is to ensure that whatever stories we're telling also have community-driven impact, meaning that we're not just asking people to watch, the films we make or the productions that we produce or curate. It's how can we include the community in these very topics that we're talking and sharing stories about. So, for example, a majority of the screenings that we are doing right now with Indigenize the Plate, we're talking with local food organizations to figure out how can we provide access to what the organizations do, so that way people who come see our film and feel a need to learn more or do more can easily have a way to find out who in their community is doing this work and how can they support that organization or that group that's doing whatever work in their area. So I think that was like the main component that I really, really wanted to do in terms of just how I approached telling stories or, making content, was how is that going to therefore serve the community and the people? Because everything I do as an artist must serve the people. It can't just serve myself. So
I love that. Yeah, no, I think storytelling is such a powerful way to really engage community. So that's amazing. So I'm going to track that and make sure that I follow up on learning more about that. Same question here, Whitney. How would you describe the important work that you are doing in and around Indigenous food sovereignty?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm coming at this from an agricultural lens. I work at the Native American Agriculture Fund, or NAF for short. And so it's a private drawdown trust fund. Our mission is ultimately to support Native American farmers and ranchers for the advancement of agriculture through projects that accomplish business assistance, agricultural education, different technical support, or advocacy services. We're wholly focused on healthy lands, healthy people, and healthy economies, and ultimately investing in work that finds solutions to the challenges that our Native American farmers and ranchers face. So to increase access to capital for Native American producers, and that in part impacts areas such as improving food access, improving food security, diversifying economic development through agriculture in both tribal and rural communities. And when we invest in agricultural efforts that support and transform food systems, but also empower Indigenous food sovereignty. And just a little bit of background about NAF so you understand where we're coming from in our work as a philanthropic organization is that we're derived originally from a class action litigation, and that was the Keepsake v. Vilsack. And that is when claims were settled based on Native American farmers and ranchers and their lack of access to credit and credit servicing. So under the Obama administration, they entered into the settlements with the Native American farmers and ranchers. And after the claims process occurred, there existed more than $250 million. And that Cypre funding led to NAF, our organization, which I mentioned is a drawdown trust fund, but that's over a period of 20 years. So our work is about spending down that principal amount of $266 million. We were originally founded in 2018, and since that time, we've been able to provide more than $70 million in grant making. And our work is actually governed by a trust agreement. And that trust agreement says who we can fund and what we can fund. But that also expands and how that impacts Indigenous food sovereignty from a bigger picture and from a bigger point of view. But we do fund 4 entity types, and that includes nonprofits, educational institutions, tribes, and then also CDFIs, or community development financial institutions. So I'm coming at this from a philanthropic funder lens, but I'm really excited to contribute to this conversation.
Yeah, no, that's great. Sounds like folks are really tapping into it and utilizing the initiative that it was intended for. And Whitney, I'm going to continue on with this next question as well, directed at you. How can the Indigenous food sovereignty movement contribute to the preservation and revitalization of traditional foodways within Indigenous communities, urban areas, other settings where Native people find themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really great question. I think in order to have healthy and sustainable foodways, I think it starts with taking care of our land. Indigenous people are the original stewards of the land. They've been cultivating it for generations. They took care of the forests, they managed soil health, preserved water, and that generational knowledge and connection between land and food systems isn't new. It's been practiced through generations to heal and protect tribal foodways and feed and sustain our Indigenous people. Indigenous people have successfully also maintained the harmonious relationships with the land and their environments for millennia to ensure not only the long-term health and resilience of the people, but also the ecosystems. And so when we're talking about Indigenous food sovereignty in action, it's inherently the preservation of traditional knowledge and culture. And that's coming to fruition in exciting and innovative ways. So as an urban native myself, I get to have those experiences through those unique experiences, like, for example, innovative culinary experiences that we're seeing that are Indigenous led, that help build connections to our Native people in urban areas. And we see that, for example, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with the Sioux chef and all kinds of Indigenous chefs that are across Indian country, revitalizing food. And you see even new approaches like Native-owned businesses in the food space, like Tokabe, and based out of Denver, Colorado, and they now have their own Indigenous food boxes that they can ship out and can build connections to folks that are in urban areas too. So all of that tradition and culture of food connected to where we are and present today, I think it's exciting, and then it's a really great opportunity to invest in the work that's being done.
Thank you for that. Natalie, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think those are such amazing examples of just again, just tangible and practical ways that people could go about figuring out how to best move about going back to cultural sustainability and how to do that when you are in urban settings. For me, a lot of the approach that I did when it came to my documentary, Indigenize the Plate, was to sort of kind of go a little deeper into where do these, where is that feeling of feeling displaced and disconnection, and how do we go back to really finding worth and value in a world where a lot of that worth and value is put into things that are like monetary or material success, for example. And I speak a lot about my perspective and my experience growing up sort of in a really weird place where, I was very fortunate to grow up with my community, grow up hearing my language, speaking my language, learning all the ancestral food practices that we did, but also being encouraged a lot, primarily from my own community, to go to college, leave the reservation, find success outside of this world, and really like being pushed to do that. And then, fast forward 15 years later and realizing, wait a minute, like that's really not what I think I should really pursue in terms of success. Like success for me would be going back to learning how to grow corn back on my mother's land, going back to how do I, figure out how to work an irrigation system. And I think a lot of the journey that I showcase through my documentary is really, I find a lot of times my generation of young folks trying to figure out how can they exist in a world where, yes, we still very much live in a world run by systems and institutions, but how do we start breaking away from that to like the like mental and emotional level that we've been so conditioned to have and believe. And so I think, really a lot of the questions I ask and I encourage people to ask in the documentary, especially young people, is where do you want your definition of success to lie? Do you want it to lie in the westernized version of it? That means you have a house, you buy a house, you have a great job that pays you this much money a year, or do you want to feel that it's more in line with who you are culturally and where you want it to be in that sense? So yes, I think that's a little bit more of a different take on it, because that's, again, the primary journey I shared through that whole experience of filming this documentary and sharing it with people.
Wow, I'm excited to look that up and see what those deeper meanings are for people and that unique perspective. So thanks for bringing that piece of it into it. So the next question back to Whitney, in what ways can Indigenous food policy be strengthened to ensure the protection and promotion of Indigenous food systems? I mean, one of the ways that fund was set aside is one of them, which is what you're working from. But if you want to add or build on that.
Yeah, great question. So I think that there's still many challenges and barriers that our tribes, but also that our Native agricultural producers face. That includes disruptions to the food supply chain, like the pandemic or different climate-related disruptions that can exacerbate the gaps in our food systems and disproportionately impact our tribal communities, because often our tribal communities are in the most remote areas of the nation. We're in the middle of food deserts. We're also in the middle of credit deserts. And this illuminates the need for Indigenous food policy or food policy that leads to further investments in Indigenous food sovereignty and rural agriculture infrastructure as well, that can be applied as solutions to those disruptions. So, we need robust systems that can serve as transportation hubs, for example, food processing facilities, distribution channels for agricultural products and services. We know, and again, I'm coming at this as a very different perspective, I think, in terms of like what we need to invest in, but we know that the economic value of agricultural production, and when I say agricultural production, I'm talking about a more robust definition of that, and to include things like aquaculture, not just your traditional farming or like cattle, for example. We know that cattle is actually one of the top agricultural production processes in Indian country, but the value of that is about $3.5 billion annually for Native producers. And so at NAF, we are finding ways to invest in things like farm production, to processing and packaging and transportation, so that what we know is when our local and regional economies capture more of that food dollar to stay in the regional economies, the potential value of Native food and agricultural sectors can reach about a little over $45 billion in potential value annually. That can surpass even something like gaming for economic opportunities for Indian country, and also sustain our food systems and feed our people. So in order to protect and promote Indigenous foodways, I think another piece when we're talking about policy is establishing tribal parity in food sovereignty. And tribal parity is at the root, I think, of the interconnectedness of land and food systems. And so when you're investing in food sovereignty or health equity work, you want to ensure that you're being inclusive of Indigenous leadership and investing in tribal communities that have continued to thrive for generations. And so efforts to strengthen tribal sovereignty over tribal food and agricultural system also includes things like upholding trust and treaty responsibilities and working with sovereign governments through various policy or farm bill provisions. We're in the middle of a farm bill year and seeing how that could have major impacts on our agricultural food systems within Indian country, but also looking at things like land repatriation efforts, different capital investments that empower those tribes and tribal producers to sustain their agricultural production. Overall, it's I think about acknowledging the unique cultural and historical and traditional ecological aspects of Native people and their relationship to the land, and aiming to restore and protect those systems while tribes are at the forefront of determining their own food systems for the well-being of their communities.
Yeah, no, thanks for that insight. I appreciate it. Natalie, policy and how it impacts your workspace. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, it's, again, very, very interesting, more different take, which I think is great because it's so amazing to hear people's thoughts and inputs depending on where we are in terms of what we do and how we do it. So this is fantastic. I'm learning so much. So for me, one of the examples that you see in the documentary is it focuses on my journey and how I've made a connection with the Quechua people in Peru. So again, one of the other main goals was to see the bridging of two indigenous cultures who are both facing the same challenges, and to sort of, again, reiterate that this is not just an indigenous people's problem, it's a global problem because we're experiencing this across so many other communities around the world. And I really wanted to showcase that, this is not a challenge and a struggle that we have alone. This is, so many other communities are dealing with this. And I really wanted to also focus on a more solution-based approach to telling the story, because we have seen a lot and have heard a lot of the challenges and again, just a lot of the trauma. And I wanted to focus how can we approach this, and what is it that I can go into and learn to better do this for my own community. And so part of that, the journey in the documentary was connecting with a chef. His name is Jose Duarte. Originally from Peru, but spent many of his youth exiled in Venezuela due to political strife that was happening there at the time. But he, way before eco-sustainability was even a conversation, he opened a restaurant in Boston and was one of the very first restaurants to really start considering how is it that he can start his business and run his business in a way that was not just equally sustainable, but also focused a lot on what other parts of sustainability is there. There's obviously the labor and food, but also there's the human aspect. And so he focused a lot on, how are humans, which are the primarily way we gather our food and do the labor, how is that being neglected, and how is it that he can start doing work that really allows the human part of this system to be taken care of just as equally. And so with that work, he opened up his restaurant, and then through the success that he found with that, was able to actually start on a project that you see in the film called the Santa Cruz Eco Lodge, which is set up in a place called Huaripampa, up in the Black Chain Andes, Black Chain of the Andes Mountains in Peru. And we go there and we make connections with the people in the community that run the lodge. And his primary goal was to set this place up so the community has ownership and has say, and how it's approached differently, for example, is that it's not just a place that you go to take a vacation, or, it's not there's no means of like it being a tourist spot, because we've seen the effects and the obstacles that have come from places like Hawaii, where mass tourism has become detrimental to their food systems and their ways of living there. And what this lodge asks of people who come to visit is there has to be an exchange of some sort. You can't just go there and just be there. The community will ask you, we will invite you to come experience, our ways of living, the food that we grow here, but we also ask that you give something in return, whether that is, and it's not money. They want to know what culturally and what knowledge you bring to them that you can teach them. And no amount of money can you pay is seen as like something acceptable. It's like, no, you have to bring a sense of teaching, whether that's you teach us something from your culture, teach us something from your skill set. It's set up in a way where they value that over any sort of monetary offer you can give them. Which again was very different, because I was like, okay, like I can get down with that, because and my offering there was, not obviously to share their story of how they do this work, but I also taught them how to make blue corn mush, because that's the dish I grew up learning to make with my mom growing up. And so I, showed them how to make the mush, and was able to teach them certain like aspects of who I am as a Diné person. And then they did, and they did an exchange where they invited me to their feast that they were having there called the Pachamanca. And it was just like, yeah, it was a beautiful sense of like, again, seeing an exchange in a way of connecting and collaborating with another culture in another different part of the world, and how it's done from not a sense of westernized viewing of like keeping things going, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Sometimes I feel like I speak and I know what I'm saying, but sometimes I don't.
No, I love it. It was very beautiful the way that you described, like it was that they wanted to accept anything else but that exchange of knowledge and the exchange of connection. I think that's beautiful. I think that's some resonates here with our own tribal communities. And I really love the way that you both talked about like the state, inside the United States and the policy there, and then how we look at the international level about how can these merge to strengthen food sovereignty for our tribal people here in the States. So
one more thing I will add is I talk about it briefly in the documentary too, is like there was this thing called the agrarian reforms that happened in Peru politically. I want to say like in the 70s. And that was that this was sort of like a way that the government was trying to step away from the Spanish colonial establishments that have been set up there, obviously through the Spanish and Portuguese people coming in. And that basically meant that, the land was given back to the people. And so in this particular area that we were at, that was one of the areas where the government said, this is your land. You see fit how you want to go about like who gets what part. And which again, not perfect, because there was a whole lot of other obstacles and challenges that came along with that. But it really was like a step forward for this community in particular to really kind of utilize the land that they got back to set up something that was going to, again, allow sharing and allow cultural exchange, but in a way that's just like, again, just not solely based on money and profit. Which to me, I've come to a place through this work and through this journey of sharing this story. I'm trying to see how to go about that myself. And what I do from here on out is like, how do I go about sustaining a food system, or sustaining a system of anything that doesn't solely derive from the colonial setup that was created for us, and I sometimes feel like such a, I don't know, lone voice in the room, always shouting like, why do we have to do it this way? Like, why do we always have to like prefer money over this and all this stuff? And
those are valid questions, very valid questions. Yeah. Thank you for sure. But I always encourage questions from the audience, and we actually have a really good question. So question from G. Miranda, what is a food system is the question. So if we could Whitney, if you want to take that on.
Yeah, great. And I think Natalie would provide some really great insight to this. But when I think about how I'm framing a food system definition, I think of not only what comes out, like the actual physical product of food, but also what goes into that. So that includes the care for the lands that the food grows on, or care for preserving the water that Indigenous people will, for generations have been catching salmon or using salmon as the way to sustain their people, but also how the food reaches people, and then how that is sustained for generations. So I think it's this holistic picture of this like harmonious relationship. And Natalie also mentioned this like harmonious back and forth relationship, but not only what we get out of the land or the waters or what our ecosystems, but also what is put into it to care and sustain it for generations.
Yeah, thank you. Did you want to add to that, Natalie?
Yeah, I feel like the only thing I would add is that Jose, the chef that's featured in the documentary, says this quote, you can't have food without culture, and you can't have culture without food. And I think that for me is a very big integration, like ingredient, as you could say, when it comes to thinking about a food system, is that there is a lot of culture that is ingrained. There we go. I was meant to say integrated and ingrained, and then it became a word. So ingrained in what it is that we put in our bodies, right? And so I think that for me was like, again, the aspect that I focused on a lot in that story. But also I think it's just just a very big part of any system besides food. I think that's why, the systems that we have set up that lack that have caused more harm than good.
Yeah. No, that was actually one that goes right into the next question we have, is like, how does culture and language revitalization, specifically in relation to food, play a role in strengthening Indigenous communities and their connection to land and heritage? And so that was something that you were starting to lean into there, Natalie. So if you want,
and I will keep going if you want me to.
Please do. Please.
Yeah, I think so some backstory. So the original title for the documentary was going to be Decolonize the Plate. And then it was alongside just like how like decolonize became such a buzzword, right? Everybody was using it for this and that. It became what, the word diversity and inclusion became, right? Because I feel like there was like a lot of like feelings around the use of this word, but also, again, when I was really diving into the internal work that happens when you are trying to do healing work of any kind, because really that's what it is it's a story of healing and going back to the essence of who you are, that I realized that, to decolonize to me is impossible personally, because decolonize also still is connected to the colonialism mindset that set up these systems in the very first place. So to decolonize something to me is just, I don't think it works, because colonization is just what it is, right? And I felt like I think when we think about going back to culture and language, we really have to step away and really dismantle. And I don't like using the word destroy because that feels very negative to me, but we have to get rid of all of these systems and institutions and the way they were set up, because we have seen time and time again that no matter how much change you can enact from within it, no matter how much you try to take it apart from the inside, and all this, to me, it just doesn't work, because that's what it is. That's the very foundation of systems and institutions, is to dehumanize and to take away. So when you're talking about trying to approach something, I think we have to figure out how to approach it in a way that truly stems from us culturally and truly stems from the community, as opposed to trying to take a system that was set up by white supremacy and colonialism and try to make it work. It doesn't. I'll just say that straight out. So I think that's my take. It's a very strong take. A lot of people might prefer to differ or find ways to do it, but I've being in the community that I was in Peru and seeing the sense of peace and the sense of happiness that community had just by doing the work they did the way they wanted to. Man, it was very like just inspiring to me to figure out how can I do that more here and not fall back into those cycles of, again, thinking, oh, I need to have it like this in order for it to mean something. I need to have it in this way so that way, you know, the community thinks that I'm doing it right. It's like, no, actually, that's all just conditioning that I've had since beyond my generation, you know, back when the boarding schools were happening, back when genocide, cultural genocide, and actual genocide was happening. So yeah, I think that's kind of like where I felt more inclined to share on that topic.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Well, I want to direct this next question from the audience from Fifilia. I hope I got that name right. A very valid question here. Good question. The question is, many of our tribal people get food from the USDA programs through commodity programs and through BIE schools. What would you recommend to the USDA dietary guidelines for the 2025, 2030 comments? And Whitney, I'll direct that to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really great question. There is some incredible work right now. For example, I'm going to just speak specifically to one program, the food distribution program on Indian reservations, FDIPR. And that, for example, they have implemented different pilot programs for tribes to have sovereignty and how those programs are implemented for their tribal communities. But also, in addition to that, they're incorporating more traditional foods that are maybe specific to the region, for example. So incorporating things like salmon or wild rice, bison. Those are just the things that are at the top of my head, but they then have had really successful implementation of that. And so that's why when I was talking about tribal parity, and especially when it comes to like sovereignty over different USDA programs and how those are implemented in our tribal communities, that's why tribal parity is so essential, because the tribes and our communities can then be at the forefront of determining what will be healthy and sustainable for that community, and maybe what was also traditionally there to sustain people for the generations before. So that's just one example, and so incorporating traditional foods into those different commodity programs is my recommendation.
Yeah, it's a great suggestion. Thank you. Do you have suggestions, Natalie?
No, I'm already moving on to the next thought.
That's awesome. I'll keep up with you, Natalie. I appreciate your insight. Yeah, so the next question, actually, I want to circle back. One of our first speakers, and it came from Maurice. And we've talked a little bit about it, but I want to make sure we recognize our great audience here and the questions are putting out there. But how does food sovereignty aid in long-term sustainability to include equitable opportunities? And Natalie, what are your thoughts?
I think one question that comes to mind when I hear the word opportunities, like I'm kind of thinking of like a little bit more outside of the box on that, because it's like opportunities like such as jobs or opportunities such as like cultural sharing. I think that's just like my one question is of just like what particular opportunities are we trying to do in the work that we do? Because I feel like that's kind of what I want to know more about. Like, what besides job opportunities can we also do when it comes to long-term sustainability? Like, does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the nuance of like asking for clarification on the nuance of the question. So we'll get Maurice to chime back in and circle back on that, on exactly what he was referring to in opportunities. Great catch. I like that. So with that, I'll jump into question number. Our next question is, what are some successful examples of grassroots organizations addressing food insecurity, food sovereignty within Indigenous communities, and how can philanthropy effectively support these initiatives? Whitney, I mean, this is your space here.
Sure, absolutely. So I we'll put a plug in for connecting with NAF for our organization. We have a network of 350 plus grantees that we fund. All of it's in some way or another related to increasing access, because the way we were funded. I'm coming at this from the capital lens. I know I'm not trying to. I'm adding a different perspective than Natalie here. I'm not trying to take away from her valuable insight of that. I'm just ultimately thinking about it from NAF's point of view and why we are structured the way we are to ultimately increase access to capital for producers, to sustain agricultural systems, which then scale down to feeding our people. So there's a different approach, there's a different perspective in that. And so when I come at this from how can philanthropic organizations or support these different initiatives, these grassroots organizations that are doing some of this work, I think about it in terms of, for example, the California Indian Museum and Cultural Center is one that comes to mind. They're supporting their tribal youth in developing their own agribusinesses to advance cultural opportunities and reclaim nutrition. So they are providing this training for their youth to continue their acorn and traditional harvesting practices that revitalize their traditional food systems in the Northern California region. And they do that through gathering and stewarding and collecting and processing acorns, which is a traditional food, and how that incorporates that and sustains that area. Or Klamath Trinity Conservation District is another example. They have a youth gillnet project that takes place in the Hoopa Valley, where they have local fishermen, native fishermen, who help teach about historical fishing rights along the Trinity River and how salmon is a food source or staple source for that people in their tribal community. And they did training on how to fillet salmon, how to can and process the fish, sanitize the fish, and but also learned about food safety guidelines, but all rooted in those traditional practices that are related to salmon. And so when you're thinking about this from a philanthropic lens, there's so much diversity of the work that's being done, but investment and a time that for example, in these projects that you spend, now they have the skill set to carry on those traditional practices that have preserved foodways for generations. But I would honestly offer from our point of view at NAF to help build those connections. Another really great organization that we work with is the Indigenous Food Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative is their name. And they are a policy research entity, and they help analyze what are some of the food security barriers that our communities are facing too. So there's various different lenses that we could approach this with, but I just wanted to name a few examples there.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And just, you spoke to us a little bit about the organizations you're currently working for and some of those, some tribes or indigenous organizations internationally. But if you want to add to that, what is your ask of philanthropy to continue to support the initiatives you're working on, Natalie, or some of your colleagues are working on?
Well, there's definitely one here in New Mexico. You might have known of this one, New Mexico Community Capital, NMCC. I've been very fortunate to have worked with several people who work with NMCC, and that's actually kind of where I made the very first connection of what story I wanted to tell in the documentary. Was they had done. They had a little event that they had at their place downtown Albuquerque, and it was all about local farmers and their stories of how they are growing their food amidst the things like the pandemic and stuff like that, and really trying to find a sense of food security when things like a pandemic happen. And it was there that I found all the amazing support and work that they give to local farmers, but also other Native entrepreneurs and Native businesses that normally, again, don't have necessarily a space or a place to kind of share their business and their work. And so they have something called the Indigenous Exchange Marketplace as well, where a lot of local Native businesses will come in and not just sell in person, but they have an online way of being able to sell their work and do their business online, which is, again, even just itself a very hard thing sometimes when you're on the reservation, and things like the internet are very difficult to come by. So I think also if we're thinking about like trying to find ways to support initiatives and ways that can help help the whole community and collaborative work, is for me, it's been trying to find out ways to get internet available for more remote areas on the reservation and in the mountains where people are growing the food, I think that's been like the pandemic definitely showed a lot of us that was the primary like disconnection that happened for a lot of people, is that, when you're not able to go in person, you're not able to be there, then, how do we go about like trying to get that access to these communities so that they can continue their livelihood, and we can continue building and regrowing and revitalizing. So that's one organization as well. And I mean, I feel like there's so many things out there that I've like come in contact with that I'm like, oh my God. But I know that one's more New Mexico based. So if you are looking for a New Mexico based organization, they're definitely great.
Yeah, great shout out to the New Mexico Community Foundation. Great collaborators, also with one of my favorite organizations, Native Women Lead. So
that's the other one. Okay.
Yeah.
I know on that one.
Lots of connection, but yeah, there's some people doing some amazing work. So thank you for pointing that out. I've definitely gone through New Mexico Community Capital for support in my entrepreneurial journey as well. So I'm glad that it's also benefited you and others. So that just makes me happy that the resources are getting put out there and that people can grow from them, and it contributes to the overall bettering Indian country. So it's exciting to hear, and I'm glad that worked out for you. The next question is, actually, I want Maurice to clarify. So back to you, Natalie. He was asking the opportunity. So let me go back to his question. How does food sovereignty aid in long-term sustainability to include equitable opportunities? And the opportunities he clarified were, it may be jobs, how long we keep our dollars within our community is what he was referring to.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you for that clarification. I really appreciate it. Let's see here. Can I have a moment to get back into that question real quick?
You bet. Did you want to, Whitney, did you want to address that?
Yeah, I think I can probably think about it from an economic development opportunity lens. And so when we're talking about the food sovereignty work, I mentioned earlier that, for example, our agricultural production value is $3.5 billion annually, but that's not wholly representative of full opportunity in terms of economic development within Indian country. But first, food sovereignty also means from this perspective, investing in our infrastructure systems that allow for our agricultural production to thrive and our food systems to thrive. So, for example, the distribution channels that, like I said, we're in really remote areas. Sometimes getting food from point A to point B is more challenging than other communities have to face. But also packaging and storage facilities. But so when we invest the dollar there, we keep we capture more of that regional and local food dollar in terms of economic value within those regional systems. And so there, at that point, then create more opportunities for increasing the number of agricultural producers, but also I would also encourage investments in education opportunities, because when that could be traditional, I don't know. I'm just trying to frame my mind of maybe what that could look like, but I guess ultimately thinking about how we capture more of that food dollar, it's investing in the food systems that allow for the structures to thrive. So I'll stick with that, and maybe we'll come back to it if I come up with another thought there.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay. Again, the one thing that comes to mind in that, thanks for giving me the time to kind of jump back into that question. That's my ADHD where I'm like, I think the Santa Cruz Eco Lodge was, I think, a really good example of that question being a tangible thing, because a lot of even though the lodge itself, does generate income from visitors coming to spend time there, they get a lot of like groups that do like retreats and like team building stuff that come to that area, because it's really hard to get to. It's not one that you could just like take a plane ride to and you're there. It's a whole journey to get to this area, but in terms of how the people who run the lodge, the community, they view the lodge as a way to not just generate income for their community and their livelihoods, but also it really does generate a way for their young people to continue learning their ancestral agricultural practices, to learn their stories, to keep their language and their music and songs and prayers going, because they view it as a way of like it's been such a great like tool for them to utilize to encourage the young people in their community to value the opportunity to keep their culture going and to keep their language going. One of the people that I spoke with, who I formed a really deep, strong bond with, is a young man named Oliver Alvarez, who now is the manager of this lodge. He was just like sort of like the community ambassador when I was there and talking with him, and now he's the general, I guess you would say, the general manager of the whole place. But he does a lot of the cultural classes that come along with like being at the lodge, because the young people there are the ones who are helping keep that alive. And so he was the one that was like spearheading the whole thing. And so he spoke a lot about like, we saw this opportunity to get young people excited about sharing their culture and being able to really be rooted in who they are. Them being able to create an income for the community was just this nice little side bonus to that. But that was where he valued that opportunity above anything else. So I think it's like, yeah, my perspective of like trying to take that word and see what more comes with it. That's kind of an example that we touched on in the story.
Yeah. So thank you for circling back on that question. Just an observation from Trey in the chat that I see here is just like speaking to bringing technology to farms, solar panel, wind turbines, and AI technologies. I mean, that's what's in front of us. And, what does that look like going forward? If Whitney, you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can say there are opportunities to invest in bringing technology to farms through solar panel, wind turbine, AI technologies, but also when we're thinking about like investing in technologies or science in tribal communities, acknowledging that traditional ecological knowledge exists, and that is a science-based approach to feeding and sustaining our people, because that has been around for generations. And so some of those solutions to address or like things like mitigate climate change and how agriculture can do that, we can look back to and involve our Indigenous leaders and our knowledge keepers and cultural preservers, just because so that they have that traditional ecological knowledge that have been doing this for a long time. So acknowledging that traditional piece alongside the innovative AI technologies and how those can work together is really an exciting opportunity. So I'll stop there and maybe see if Natalie has any insights as well.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing that I think of a lot when I think of AI technology in particular is the thing that terrifies me about AI is the human aspect not being there. Because I think I appreciate Whitney, you saying how cultural based practices are technology, because there have been thousands and thousands of years of the way peoples have approached growing food, for example, that's technology. Whereas for me, AI is always a terrifying thing to think about when I think how much of that is not a human based approach. Like how is it that you can have something that humans do and make without the human part being in it. So that's always a question I always ask myself, of like understanding how helpful AI can be. But yeah, how do you be something human without being human? I don't know. That's always what I think of. I'm just like, I don't know what that looks like, and I don't know like if there is a way to regulate that, or like figure out ways that it can be done that again doesn't generate more harm. Because we are seeing a lot of things that are coming about because of things like AI, that have made it more difficult for people to even just like live and like do what it is that they do for their job or their work or their artistry. So I think that's just something that I would like to leave as a question for people, of like, how do we go about that approach, when the human aspect of just how we go about our lives in general is when that's not included.
Yeah. Now the AI is tricky, right? It's a slippery slope. I mean, you want to use technology to better the ways, but you also want to make sure that you're valuing and honoring the human aspect of things. So that it's a trick. It's tricky for sure. So I want to give you an opportunity to talk more and perhaps promote Indigenize the Plate. So for Natalie, what role can storytelling and filmmaking play in raising awareness about Indigenous food sovereignty and inspiring the action that we need to take?
Yeah, like I said before, I mean, stories are so powerful. I mean, we see it every day. Like, for example, like the story of the Terminator, that made me so scared of AI, like, even though that's like, a fictionalized approach to like, to a real life thing like AI right now is like, I always that's the story that I go back to when I think about it. I'm like, oh my gosh, like Skynet, the world's going to get taken over by robots, right? So I think like the idea of like of stories and how much weight they carry, is very is a very like, we have to approach that with so much care as like people who tell stories. So for me being a filmmaker, I always think about like, how is it this story is going to impact whoever is watching it, whoever is listening to it. And I think right now there is more of a push now to ensure that whatever stories are being shared about what communities are out there, that those stories come from the communities within. I mean, I can name so many examples of so many like, films and TV shows that have come out within the last 5 years, right? That have really done a lot of work in pushing that initiative to say, hey, like, if you're going to tell a story about an Indigenous person or a community, it has to come from the community itself. The people who tell it have to be at least from the community or have some knowledge about it, because we can see how harmful and how trauma is perpetuated when it's not being told in a way that's honorable and that is misrepresented. And so I think when I think about how I go about telling a story, it's not just whatever people are seeing on a screen or seeing on the stage. It's every aspect of it has to honor the human part of it. Yeah. That's where my thoughts went.
How can we access or indigenize the plate? Like, where do we go find that?
Yeah, so if you go to www.pbs.org, you can check your local listings and see when it's going to be airing on PBS on your station or in your area. You can also stream it on PBS Passport, which is PBS's like main app to stream any of their documentaries, their shows. So PBS Passport. We also are going to be scheduling a road show tour, where we're going to be working with different organizations such as NMCC. We have another screening set up in November here with Creative Startups. So we're still like booking screenings depending on who wants to be able to showcase the film, but also like what organization are we going to partner with to just not make it a film screening. We want to, for example, in Denver, we have a screening where we're working with Native Max Magazine and a local chef, Andrea from what is it? For oh my God, I need to look up the name of her business, but like she's going to be providing the menu for the evening, so it's going to be all like ancestral based foods and yeah, so it's just like, so that's also still what we're doing. So yeah, be on the lookout for any screenings that we have coming out, but you can also watch it on PBS. So
yeah, your friends at Native Americans in Philanthropy have populated the chat with www.pbs.org on where to find
thank
it.
you.
So, yes, of course, that's what we do. We help each other here. For Whitney, this next question, we have this whole audience is our philanthropic partners and collaborators and supporters. So how can philanthropic organizations support policy work that addresses systemic issues of food insecurity and promotes the rights and self-determination of Indigenous people and communities?
Yeah, I love this question. So, I'm going to start off by saying research and data is essential for informing decisions, and for sovereign tribal governments who are reclaiming and revitalizing their food systems, it's critical to have an accurate representation of what's happening within that community in order to govern and respond to things like hunger needs or food insecurity. And so when there are gaps, or also like capital access for producers is another example. So when there are gaps in data access or limited federal data collection on food insecurity that are accessible by tribes or through by also agricultural producers, that can result in inadequate responses to meet those needs of the Native communities. And especially during times of disruption like the global pandemic, there needs to be data that comes from within our communities. Much like Natalie was saying, our stories need to come from within our communities. So does our data and research. And so this effort to really begin and support data research across the sector of food and agriculture to ensure that tribal governments and Native producers are at the forefront of that decision making based off of that data in order to meet those needs is essential. So fund Indigenous-led research and data collection. Often the data about agriculture does not specifically identify Indigenous populations. There is an agricultural census data that comes out, but we know that has gaps and it doesn't wholly or accurately fully capture the breadth of impact of Native agriculture. And so some of that is sometimes skewed and doesn't always accurately represent the full picture of agriculture. So invest in that. I would also encourage philanthropic organizations to invest in and build upon what's already working. Have flexible funding models. So instead of focusing on how Indigenous entities or people fit into your funding structure, think about an approach that looks at how your funding structure can fit into the work that's being done. And then, finding ways to prioritize equitable funding opportunities. Earlier, Natalie mentioned broadband access in a lot of our remote and rural areas. So even just being considerate of maybe the limitations for the application processes for a lot of your grant funding, for example, and how there might be limitations to access to broadband. So building those equitable systems that allow for folks to apply for your funding. And then also another example I want to speak to in how we provide funding and grant making at NAF, we fund 4 different entity types for the work of agricultural business, advocacy services, technical support as relates to agriculture, but we also have different funding emphasis areas. So for example, right now we're seeing really high rates of inflation, and that's going to impact agricultural producers and what they can afford in terms of input costs for their operations. And so having a funding opportunity that addresses that specific need and the current challenges that our tribes are facing, that's also crucial. So do your research, be intentional about who you're funding, and where you're funding, but also build trust first and foremost. Utilize organizations or folks that are already working on the ground and have that established trust with Indigenous communities is essential. So that's my top tier recommendations there. But if anybody has any specific questions, I would be happy to address some of those.
Yeah, no, thanks, Whitney. I do have a really good question here in the chat that I'm seeing from the Deschutes Estuary Restoration Team. And the question is, a lot of funding is coming up in Washington State to restore riparian and wetland ecosystems, which are traditionally cultivated habitats. Do you see a place in restoration work for enhancing food security? And Whitney, I'll direct that to you.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm going to say I'm a little bit unfamiliar with that specific restoration work, but I mean, I would absolutely say that restoration of that ecosystem does enhance food security opportunities. I would love to maybe point this person and direct them and connect them with some of our folks that we fund out in Washington State that are maybe doing this on the ground. But at the moment, I'd love to maybe just take a second to try to do some research for you. But if you want to come back to me, or if Natalie has any insights.
Well, being in New Mexico, I mean, the number one thing here is water. Water restoration, because of just a lot of the history of the contamination of water due to things like uranium mining. Like specifically on the Navajo reservation, uranium mining is a huge issue. I grew up with a grandfather and a father who worked in the uranium mines, and they talked a lot about how the local water sources were used to do everything there, and now that is impacting environmentally a lot of the ways that we can even grow food on our lands anymore. And also when you add in the drought on top of that, like I think a lot of the work here primarily in New Mexico is trying to find ways to restore water, which is a huge challenge. So I'm also with Whitney. There's a lot that I would need to look into to figure out how that pertains to other areas that are right now in Turtle Island. But but again, restoring food, ancestral foodways is a way that we enhance our food security for sure. I 100% back that up. So.
Yeah, so as we start to wind up, and we like to give our guest speakers, our panelists, the last word here. Our audience is largely funders, as I mentioned, with opportunities to change philanthropy through partnerships and organizations like what the organizations you're with now. What would be one thing you want them to leave with and have a better understanding of? And I know that when you mentioned one of the things was like building that trust. Natalie, what would you ask? What's the ask?
I'm gonna use what I learned when I was at the Santa Cruz Eco Lodge, when I spent time with the Quechua people there, and from Ollie, is that, yes, monetary support is fantastic. I mean, we get a lot done when we have the funds and the funding to do what it is that we do. But I would say I encourage everyone to look beyond that material way of giving and more about like, how are you connecting with the people that you are giving support to beyond just that? So whether that is, you go to a feast day, you go to like, a little like, celebration thing that they're having, or just whatever ways to always honor that human connectedness that is so needed right now in the world. Because without our ability to connect to one another, the more those harmonious and, Diné people, we call it hajo, the balance of everything in life and who we are with each other, both human, non-human, environment, to things that we can like, hold in our hands, finding ways to be as connected to the people that you're supporting and to the communities you're supporting. I highly, highly encourage figuring out what that looks like for you all. So that way, again, it's moving towards a sense of healing, which that is just my main vision for the world, is that we start to heal. Yeah.
Thank you. And what about you, Whitney? Any closing words here?
Yeah, I think what Natalie said was great. And in building on that, intentionally creating, I think, understanding that there's not one approach to addressing these disparities at a systemic level. It's going to be unique for every tribal community. So be intentional about researching, understanding those historical patterns or policies or practices that have disenfranchised or displaced Native communities and have led to these lack of resources, especially in the agricultural and food space. But also understanding that when you're talking about food sovereignty, that's also speaks to the interconnectedness of a lot of different things in Indian country and also in our communities. It's about also when we're talking about health equity or traditional cultural preservation or economic development, all of that can be tied back or connected to Indigenous food sovereignty and foodways. So there's going to be, ways to, very different ways to address some of those disparities, but also speaking and referring back to something Natalie mentioned earlier, focusing on our strength-based outcomes, not just our disparities, and how our communities have thrived and sustained for generations. It's, and honoring that piece of that as well, I think is important.
Awesome. Well, it has been an incredible, amazing experience to be in the space with you, to learn from you. A story of healing, how we approach our work with peace and joy, all the great insight that was gained here. I thank you. I thank the audience for the incredible questions that they asked. It was a really active, lots of questions came in. You all were ready to handle those. I appreciate you. So thank you all. Thank you, audience, for being a part of this learning opportunity. I appreciate each of you. I wish each of you continued success in the work that you're doing. We need that kind of work. We need that kind of passion around this work, and the approaching it with that peace and joy. So with that, I will turn it back over to Trey to close us out.
Watea, y'all. That's all I have to say. What a great conversation. And I think really Natalie talking about the different viewpoints and perspectives that were represented. I think we really got kind of a full view, or at least an introductory view, into Indigenous food sovereignty and what that means. So, wow, I'm in shock. So miigwech, Steph, and Iguian to you and Whitney and Natalie for that conversation. I'd also like to extend just a moment of thanks to the members of our audience and those that have joined us. Native Americans in Philanthropy sessions like this are so important. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time out of your calendar to listen and participate. I do want to do a little bit of a disclaimer. The AI question was not mine. I do appreciate the shout out in the session, but no, that belongs to Maurice. So thank you, Maurice, for participating on our LinkedIn. I did just want to make sure that credit goes where credit is due. So our speakers have shared some invaluable stories and lessons from their work within and on behalf of Indian country. Whether you join alongside them in that work or have roles supporting or even adjacent to Indigenous communities and people, I hope you are taking new knowledge and understanding away from our time together. Traditional foodways are key to food sovereignty, and they must be protected and expanded within our communities. As a reminder, this session was open to the public as a highlight of our member benefits. NAP membership is open to our Indigenous and non-Indigenous relatives and allies. If you're not a NAP member and want to learn more, please visit nativephilanthropy.org or email Rod Jacobs at rjacobs@nativephilanthropy.org. Finally, it may be difficult to believe, but we at NAP are turning some of our attention and efforts to planning for the 2024 calendar year. We need your help, though. Something that makes our member education so important to our work is that the topics are driven by you. In your inbox or shortly after we wrap up, you should be receiving an email with a link to a brief survey. Please take time to share your thoughts. Altogether, it takes about 4 minutes to complete, but provides invaluable feedback for these types of events and for planning future events such as this when it comes to topics. Thank you once again for joining us this afternoon. We'll see you on Tuesday, November 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our next member education session, Partnering Across the Field. Miigwech, everyone. Bamapi.